In 1914, a woman sat inside a house she could no longer afford and worked out, calmly and on paper, how to squeeze money out of the King of England. Not a merchant, not a duke, but George V himself, 4 years into the job and weeks away from watching Europe eat itself. Her weapon. A bundle of love letters written to her by the man in the portrait hanging behind his desk, meaning his father. I have covered plenty of people on this channel who seized power the ordinary way, by inheriting an army or winning an election or shooting somebody important, and Daisy Greville managed none of that. No office, no command, no vote for most of her life. And yet for roughly a decade she could pick up a pen, write to the future King Edward VII, and watch a grown man with a navy at his disposal go after one of his own admirals on her behalf. That's my opening claim, and I want you holding on to it because I intend to complicate the daylights out of it before we finish. Daisy Greville understood something most of her class never worked out, which is that closeness to a throne converts into pressure, and pressure doesn't care what your title reads. She spent that pressure on parties, then on burying her own mistakes, and then, in a turn nobody inside Marlborough House saw coming, she aimed the same instinct at the entire class of people who created her. Let's back up 53 years. Frances Evelyn Maynard arrived on December 10th, 1861. Everybody called her Daisy, and I'll call her Daisy too, partly because the sources do, and partly because Frances Evelyn Greville, Countess of Warwick, eats 4 full seconds every time I attempt it, and this video already runs long enough without me pronouncing that 40 times. Her father died when she turned 3 years old. Most of us at that age still negotiate daily with a flight of stairs, and this child inherited a position that rearranged her entire future, because with her father gone, she became heiress to her grandfather's estates, and those estates ran enormous, not comfortable. Before she could reliably tie her own shoes, Daisy ranked among the most eligible young women in England, and the establishment noticed within about a decade. Queen Victoria noticed too. The palace floated Daisy as a possible bride for Prince Leopold, the Queen's youngest son, which means that somewhere in the 1870s, serious people in serious rooms discussed marrying this girl straight into the royal family. Nothing came of it. Sit with what that does to a person's sense of scale, though. Before Daisy accomplished a single thing under her own steam, before she uttered one interesting sentence in public, the machinery of the British establishment had already sorted her into the royal adjacent pile, and she grew up treating the people at the top of the country as neighbors. That isn't arrogance, it's the water she swam in from infancy, and it explains a startling amount of her later behavior, right down to the afternoon she decided that blackmailing a monarch fell comfortably within her range of options. In 1881, at 19, Daisy married Francis Greville, Lord Brooke, and 12 years later, in 1893, Frances inherited the earldom. That upgraded her from Lady Brooke to Countess of Warwick and handed her one of the more recognizable buildings in England. Behind me sits Warwick Castle, 11th century foundations, towers, the whole medieval fantasy in stone. By the 1890s, the woman running the social calendar inside these walls had turned the place into one of the 2 addresses that counted if you wanted to matter in late Victorian England. The other one sits down in Essex, an estate called Easton Lodge, and I'll come back to Easton Lodge later because Easton Lodge is where this story turns genuinely absurd. First, though, the wedding, which ranked as the social event of the 1881 season. Standing beside the groom as best man, Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to the throne of the British Empire, future King Edward VII, and a man destined to occupy a rather different position in Daisy's life inside of a decade. Foreshadowing. I want to slow down on the sequence because the sequence carries the whole thing. The Prince of Wales stood up at her wedding in 1881, and roughly 8 years later he became her lover, while her husband Francis kept living in the same houses across that entire stretch, hosting the same guests, apparently untroubled enough that the arrangement survived the better part of a decade. Victorian aristocratic marriage ran on a rule book that would put a modern couples counselor in the hospital. Daisy played inside those rules with more appetite than almost anybody in the country. By the middle of the 1890s, she had converted both Warwick Castle and Easton Lodge into the beating center of elite British society, and her 1895 powder ball became one of those evenings people described to each other for years afterward. She also dominated the Marlborough House set, the exclusive circle orbiting the Prince of Wales, a crowd defined by money, leisure, and an approach to fidelity best described as flexible. Daisy didn't merely receive invitations to that world, she ran a substantial slice of it. So how does a woman travel from hosting the Prince of Wales to sleeping with him? Through a scandal so petty, so soap operatic, so wildly out of proportion to everything it eventually caused, that I read the account twice to confirm I hadn't skipped a page somewhere. Before the prince, Daisy conducted an affair with Lord Charles Beresford, a naval officer and a fixture of that same social set, which counted as fairly standard fare for the period. The wheels came off when she learned that Lord Charles had resumed intimate relations with his own wife, the woman he married, and that Lady Charles now carried his child. Dang. Furious, Daisy did precisely what furious people did in 1889, and precisely what furious people still do at 2 a.m. on their phones, which is write it all down and send it. One letter addressed to Lord Charles, absolutely stuffed with indiscretion, the sort of document that cannot survive contact with any pair of eyes beyond the intended ones. Guess which pair of eyes it hit? Lord Charles had sailed off on a naval campaign, and before leaving he instructed his wife to open his mail. So Lady Charles Beresford, pregnant, slid open an envelope from her husband's mistress and read a letter complaining about her own pregnancy. Take a moment to admire the craftsmanship of this disaster, because every element of it traces back to a decision Daisy took herself, in her own handwriting, with nobody holding her arm. Lady Charles didn't scream and burn the thing. She chose something colder and considerably more effective, handing the letter over to Sir George Lewis, the society solicitor of the age, the man wealthy Londoners retained precisely because he knew where every body in the city lay buried. Lewis locked the letter away for safekeeping, and Lady Charles let the word circulate that Daisy's reputation now sat in a drawer controlled by somebody else. That should have finished Daisy Greville as a social force, since reputation functioned as currency in that world, and hers had just fallen into the hands of a woman with every reason on earth to spend it. So Daisy climbed over everybody's head. She appealed directly to the Prince of Wales, not to a friend, not to a lawyer, not to her husband, but to the heir of the British throne, on a matter that could not possibly have been more embarrassing to raise with him. And this is the part I find genuinely wild about her. It worked. The prince took her side and moved against Lord Charles Beresford, a serving naval officer and a member of his own circle, on behalf of a woman whose problem originated entirely with herself. The fallout ran for years afterward, opening a bitter feud between the Prince of Wales and Lord Charles, and the sources report a physical altercation between the two of them. A physical altercation between the future King of England and one of his admirals over a letter about somebody's pregnancy. And somewhere in the middle of that mess, the prince fell in love with her. The relationship that grew out of the Beresford wreckage around 1889 ran until 1898, nearly 9 years, with Daisy operating as the Prince of Wales's semi-official mistress. That role carried zero legal standing and an alarming quantity of practical power. Now I need to explain the rules of this world, because without the rules, the next part lands flat. Victorian aristocratic culture tolerated extramarital affairs quietly, implicitly, with a shrug and a change of subject over the fish course, provided one condition held: discretion. You could do essentially anything you liked behind a closed door in a country house, and the whole system would swivel its eyes toward the ceiling, as long as you never forced anybody to acknowledge it aloud. Talking counted as the sin, not the affair. Daisy could not stop talking. Her habit of telling tales about the 1889 Beresford business earned a nickname that trailed her for the rest of her life, the Babbling Brook, a pun on her title as Lady Brooke, and a fairly savage one at that. Notice what it doesn't accuse her of, though. Nobody called her immoral. They called her leaky, and in a society running on discretion as its entire operating system, a name like that pins a permanent asterisk beside you. Then came 1891 and the Royal Baccarat scandal. Short version, a gambling incident at a country house called Tranby Croft, with the Prince of Wales present, detonated into a public scandal that dragged the heir to the throne through the newspapers for weeks. Somebody leaked it, and across society, the person widely blamed for that leak was Daisy. Did she leak it? My research brief tells me society blamed her widely, and I'm going to stop exactly there rather than pretend I can settle a 130-year-old whisper campaign from behind a desk with a camera pointed at it. But the accusation stuck to her, and it stuck because it fit the shape people had already assigned her. Once your neighbors brand you as the woman who repeats things, every leak in London carries your fingerprints whether you touched it or not. Which brings me back to something I keep circling. Daisy kept her position at the center of that world not by obeying the rules of her class, but in defiance of the loudest one, breaking discretion repeatedly and publicly and expensively, and she remained beside the prince for 9 years regardless. That isn't luck. That's a woman who correctly identified where the actual power sat, and then rendered herself impossible to pry loose from it. I'm standing on what remains of the Easton Lodge grounds, and I want to tell you about the single most on-brand thing Daisy Greville ever pulled off. The Prince of Wales enjoyed visiting, obviously, but shifting the heir to the British throne around the countryside in the 1890s created a logistics headache because the prince traveled with an entourage. Entourages attract attention, and attention remained the one substance this entire arrangement could not survive contact with. So in 1895, Daisy financed the construction of a railway station. You heard that right. Not a discreet carriage, not a side gate through the kitchen garden, but a functioning station on the existing Great Eastern Railway line, paid for out of her own accounts, built specifically so the Prince of Wales and his people could reach Easton Lodge without parading across a public platform in the nearest market town. Hold that beside the ordinary picture of what a royal mistress does, which involves a woman waiting somewhere decorative until a powerful man turns up. Daisy re-engineered regional rail infrastructure to fix his scheduling problem. She bankrolled his hedonism, organized it, and stripped the friction out of it, which describes an operational role rather than a decorative one, and it tells you exactly how she read her own position. She never treated herself as the prize waiting at the end of the journey. She built the journey. Line up what she pulled off inside 6 years, and the shape of her power sharpens considerably. During the Beresford affair, she maneuvered the future King of England into aggressively threatening one of his own peers to bury a mess she created, and in 1895 she rearranged a railway line to smooth out his private life. The first move protects her, while the second one serves him. Both of them run through her, and both demand somebody with money, nerve, and a total absence of embarrassment. That station cost her, though. Everything in Daisy's life cost her, and the bill arrives in about 20 minutes. In 1898, the romantic relationship ended, and Alice Keppel stepped in as the prince's primary mistress. Under normal circumstances, that closes the file, since the mistress loses her place, fades from view, and collects a paragraph from historians before they move along to whoever came next. None of that occurred here. The reason it didn't tells you the affair had never formed the whole basis of her position. Daisy remained one of his most trusted confidants. In 2001, the prince became King Edward VII, and across his entire reign from 2001 through 1910, he kept retreating to her estates to escape the pressure of the court, seeking her counsel on family matters and on his relationships with the women who succeeded her. Read that last part again because it is genuinely strange and genuinely revealing. The King of the United Kingdom consulted his former mistress about his current mistress, and nobody does that unless he rates the woman's judgment above the awkwardness. 9 years as a lover, then roughly another 12 as a permanent fixture inside the private life of a reigning monarch, with direct access to a man whose casual opinions moved through the British establishment like weather. She held no office and no vote, only the ear of the king at his own invitation for 2 decades, and she slid closer to bankruptcy the entire time. Now, The part of this story that nobody sees coming, and I suspect that includes Daisy. Somewhere in the middle of all this, the most socially connected hostess in Edwardian England turned into a socialist. Not a fashionable dabbler, not a woman who skimmed a pamphlet and deployed something provocative at dinner to watch the Duchess flinch, but a card-carrying member of the Social Democratic Federation who devoted the second half of her life to campaigning for organized labor against the direct financial interest of every single person she had ever hosted. The transition began with philanthropy, which deserves a pause because the popular version presents this as a lightning bolt while the sources present it as a process. In 1998, the same year the royal affair ended, Daisy launched a scheme for women's agricultural education in Reading. Agricultural education for women in 1998. That program relocated to Studley Castle in 1903 and grew into Studley College, and the archive of the institution now lives at the Museum of English Rural Life at the University of Reading, which is how we know as much about it as we do. Start there and follow the arithmetic. Running an agricultural school drops you into rooms with actual land, actual wages, and actual women who need training because the economy left no other door open to them. Paternalist charity puts a countess face to face with the people her class depends on for everything, and if she pays even mild attention, the numbers stop adding up in a way she can defend at dinner. Two radical journalists, Robert Blatchford and W.T. Stead, worked on her steadily through those years, and in November 1904 she formally joined the Social Democratic Federation. The Countess of Warwick, Mistress of Warwick Castle, former companion of the king, dues-paying member of a socialist organization. They called her the Red Countess, and unlike the babbling brook, she earned this one deliberately. Plenty of wealthy people have flirted with radical politics from behind a hedge, and the test never involves what you say at a party. The test arrives when actual workers strike against actual owners, because that's the morning your friends discover which side you picked. Daisy passed the test twice in public with her name attached. She backed the London dockers' strike in 1912, then backed the Essex agricultural laborers' strike in 1914, and that second one cuts closer to the bone. Easton Lodge sits in Essex, and agricultural labor in Essex meant, in a great many cases, the precise economic arrangement funding her own estate. Supporting striking dockers 100 miles away costs a countess a few dinner invitations, while supporting striking farm laborers in your own county puts you across the table from your neighbors permanently. Then, in 1923, she stood for Parliament as a Labour candidate and lost. I want to name the man who beat her because I promise you the sources aren't inventing this for our entertainment. The Conservative who defeated the Red Countess in 1923 was Anthony Eden, a relative of hers by marriage and a future Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Geez. Beaten by a Tory in-law, which is a very specific flavor of loss. Look at the distance she covered, though. The woman who once financed a private railway station to smuggle a prince into her drawing room stood for election under a working-class banner, in her 60s against her own family, inside a system that had only recently permitted women like her to sit in the Commons at all. She lost the seat and never lost the argument, and that argument came with an invoice attached, because underneath all of it, the money kept draining out. Now the two halves of Daisy Greville collide, and the collision isn't pretty. Decades of lavish spending sat on one side of the ledger, covering powder balls, house parties, a personally financed railway station, and an entire social operation designed around entertaining the heir to the throne. Decades of philanthropy sat on the other side, and an agricultural college doesn't fund itself, nor does bankrolling political causes that generate precisely zero revenue. By 1914, Daisy Greville was effectively bankrupt. King Edward VII had died in 1910, and his son George V now wore the crown with a temperament roughly opposite to his father's. Dutiful, private, and heavily invested in the respectability of the monarchy at a moment when respectability looked like the family's main remaining asset. Daisy still owned the letters. Years of correspondence from Edward VII, written to her privately, sat in her possession while her creditors circled, So she approached the new king and threatened to publish his dead father's love letters unless somebody cleared her debts. I've thought hard about how to describe this without excusing it and without climbing onto a soapbox, and I land here. She blackmailed a grieving son. She knew exactly what she was choosing, and she did it anyway because the alternative meant public ruin at 52 with nothing left to sell. That's the woman in Tyre. She spent her whole life converting relationships into pressure, and when every other relationship had run dry, the last one left in the drawer belonged to a dead king. The Crown could not let those letters reach a printing press. Somebody needed to make the problem vanish. And that somebody turned out to be Arthur Ducrot, a wealthy British industrialist who quietly paid off £64,000 of Daisy's debts in exchange for the correspondence. £64,000 in 1914, a figure that doesn't shrink when you drag it forward a century. Nobody handed that over as a donation to a worthy cause, since the price bought silence paid by a private citizen on behalf of a monarchy that could not afford to appear anywhere near the transaction. 2 years later, in 1916, Arthur Ducrot received a baronetcy. The Crown's official reasoning cited his wartime contributions, including organizing a motor ambulance service, alongside his success in the rubber industry, both entirely real, both perfectly defensible grounds for an honor in the middle of the First World War, when the government handed out titles to industrialists doing useful things. And historians have squinted at that timeline for a century. The widespread suspicion, and I'm choosing my words carefully because the official documents do not prove it, holds that the baronetcy functioned as a quid pro quo for cleaning up the blackmail crisis. Man settles the ex-mistress's debts, man receives a hereditary title, and the gap between those two events measures about 24 months. Unproven, widely suspected, and exactly the sort of arrangement that by design never generates the paperwork that would settle the question. One more wrinkle, and it delivers the biggest laugh in the entire story. Daisy sold the threat rather than the product because her whole play rested on the implication that Edward VII's letters ran hot, that they contained passion and scandal and material capable of humiliating the royal family across the front pages for months. That implication turned £64,000 into a bargain. Later, when copies of those letters came under the eyes of historians, and notably under the eyes of her own daughter, the verdict came back underwhelming. Affectionate society gossip, chatty and warm and fond, nothing explosive, nothing capable of toppling anybody, and quite possibly nothing capable of selling a newspaper for longer than a week. So did she know? Did Daisy understand that her nuclear option amounted to a firecracker on a damp fuse and run the bluff anyway, betting that nobody inside the palace would dare call it? Or had she spent 30 years living inside her own legend and genuinely believed those letters carried more heat than they did? The sources don't settle it, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Consider this, though. The woman who earned the name Babbling Brook understood better than almost anybody alive how much more damage a rumor does than a fact, and she had experienced that math from the wrong end in 1891, blamed across society for a Tranbycroft leak that may never have come from her at all. In 1914, she ran the same calculation in the opposite direction. The Crown paid every penny. The money didn't last, naturally. By 1928, Daisy faced debtor's prison, which for a woman who once welcomed the future King of England to a ball inside her own castle, represents about as complete a reversal as the British class system could manufacture. She needed cash again, and only one asset remained unsold, which was the story itself. So she negotiated her memoirs could reach print on the condition that royal censors read the manuscript first and vetted the contents. Sit with the shape of that deal for a second. The palace had already paid a fortune to bury her version of events, and now palace officials perched in a room with a red pencil, working through her pages line by line, deciding what the British public would learn about the reign of Edward VII. Daisy needed the advance, the Crown needed the edits, everybody signed. The book reached shelves in 1929 under the title Life's Ebb and Flow. published by William Morrow, and this is the detail I didn't expect when I started reading for this video. It's good. Not good for a censored aristocratic memoir, actually good, and historians treat it as one of the most authentic and beautifully written primary sources we possess on Edwardian aristocratic society, which means the woman mocked for decades as the one who talked too much turned out, when handed a deadline and a financial gun to her head, to write like a professional, vetted by the palace and still the clearest window anybody has into that world. I find that outcome enormously satisfying. They took the letters and edited the manuscript, yet she claimed the last word on the centuries she had lived through, and her sentences are the ones historians keep quoting. Okay. I lied to you at the beginning, not about the facts, about the frame. I opened this video by telling you Daisy Greville held more power than the king, and I sold you the Beresford affair as proof because she pointed the future king of England at one of his own admirals, and off he marched. Great story, and also the least interesting variety of power she ever touched. That power came borrowed. Every ounce of it ran through a man's affection, which means it could evaporate the instant that affection relocated, and in 1889 it did relocate to Alice Keppel. If the affair represented the sum total of Daisy Greville, we would file her exactly where we file most royal mistresses, as a footnote inside somebody else's biography with a cruel nickname attached. Her modern biographers land somewhere more useful. Margaret Blunden in 1967 and Sushila Anand in 2008 both read her as a political actor in her own right, a woman who picked up whatever instrument the world left within reach at any given moment. Young, beautiful, and close to the throne. Use that. Older, broke, holding a bundle of correspondence. Use that too. Talked round by a couple of radical journalists into believing the system feeding you is indefensible. Join the Social Democratic Federation, back the dockers, back the Essex farm laborers, stand for Parliament at 61 and lose to your own relative. Blunden and Anand point at the same thread, and it isn't consistency because Daisy never behaved consistently for 10 straight years in her life. The thread is refusal. As a Victorian hostess, she refused discretion. As a countess, she refused the politics of her own bank balance. As a bankrupt, she refused to disappear politely. And then as an author, under censorship, she refused to produce a bad book. That's a woman who bridged Victorian elite hedonism and 20th century labor reform inside a single lifetime without ever fully releasing either end of the rope. Do I like her? Partly. That 1889 letter to Lord Charles Beresford opened a wound she inflicted on herself and then handed to everybody else to carry, including a pregnant woman who did nothing to deserve any of it, and the 1914 blackmail amounted to extortion pointed at a grieving son. No quantity of "she funded a women's agricultural college" balances that out. Ugh. But the Studley students existed, and so did the dockers, those Essex laborers standing against the landowning class. In 1914 received public backing from a countess with an actual castle behind her, which required something most of her friends never located in themselves. Good? No. Hypocrite? Also no, at least not in the cheap sense, because hypocrites don't campaign against their own income for 20 years. Daisy understood pressure better than anyone in the room, and she kept changing her mind about where to point it.